Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Learning Live. We are back to school and back to basics at PCW. So, tonight I am simply going to turn over the creating to Kris, Crafty Kris, who is going to talk to us tonight about embossing folders. See people chiming in, lots of people saying hello. So, Kris, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sherry. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, I'm just going to do a little bit of basics about embossing folders. I know a lot of you have them out there. You have your machines. You've been using them for a while, but it's not a bad idea to go back and review where it all begins, just to make sure that you're using your equipment properly and you're not going to run into any problems with depressurizing your systems and things like that. So tonight's intention is to sort of understand a little bit about the different kinds of embossing folders that are out there. In order to use an embossing folder, you have some basic equipment that you need. So you need your machine. This one is a Big Shot. There's many different varieties. There's electronic ones, there's mini ones. There's all kinds of different varieties of embossing machines. So you want to make sure that you get the right size embossing folders for the machine you have. So that's your basic first step. Then with that machine, you'll have things like plates that you can purchase. So we have a base plate, and on most machines, base plates, there are recipes of how to put together the plates in order to cut thinlit dies and do different types of older style dies and the new textured embossing folders. And you might have your thinlit die adapter, which comes in handy when you have an odd shaped die, and an odd shape embossing folder. And I'll go into that more as we go through things. And then you have two plates. So that's your basic. Let's get started, and we can do any kind of die cutting and embossing with these things. So a little bit about embossing folders. Did I get everything on my basic equipment? Oh, and I should talk a bit about paper as well. So you can emboss anything. Your results are going to vary depending on how you treat it. So tonight I have decided to use cardstock, which we're all familiar with, and I think this is an 80-pound cardstock. It's kind of your standard card embossing cardstock, and your pattern paper or colored paper may fall in the range of 60 to 80. And I'm also going to do some tests on thin paper, because once in a while we go to a craft garage sale and we pick up some of the older paper thin paper, and it would be nice to know what works with that. So in my case, I'm not using that kind of paper, but I'm using photocopy paper. So it's very thin. So you can get a sense of why things are done the way that they're done. All right, so let's talk a bit about folder plates. So two-dimensional folder plates they have many different names, but the bottom line for a two-dimensional folder is to have two levels of embossing. So in this folder, you can see I've glimmered my embossing folder. That'll happen. I'll work with this line. The black background is one level, and then the white area next to the black background, say that fast 4 times, is the second level up. Or if you look at the positive side, you have the petals are your first layer, and then the interior and around the petals are the second layer. So there's 2 layers of depth in this folder. The edges are all, I call them hard edges. So what I'm saying is there's no rounding on them. They're actually like corners. So where this meets that, the upper piece has a corner on it, on the lip. So that's what constitutes a two-dimensional folder. Then we have this hybrid, which is called a multi-level folder. And this has usually got 3 levels, but it's still not considered a 3D folder for a particular reason. So when I go into this particular folder, I have my background, just like I had with my 2D folder. And then I can go up one more level to what I call a midground, which you don't have in this. And then I have the front ground or the foreground piece, which is a 3rd layer. So it's like 3 steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3. The reason this isn't 3D, you think it was because it's got 3 levels, is because the edges, again, are hard edges. They come to a crisp cutting edge. There's no sculpting to it at all or rounding in it at all. So this does not exactly fit the description of a 2D, and it doesn't fit the description of a 3D. So it has been called a multi-level texture plate. And you'll see that out and about in your shopping. Sizzix has quite a few of them. And now I'm going to talk to you about a 3D and why a 3D, first of all, is a 3D, but also is a much more detailed, more textural plate. With a 3D plate, you have rounded edges. You may have also some edges that are butted up, but most of the edges of the dots, the flowers, the edges of the circle have a rounded edge to them. So they do not cut into the paper. They are not sharp in any way. And it's more sculpted. So if I can bring this right up, let's see if I can, oh, you can see better on this one. It's higher here at the end of the petal, and it kind of slopes down into the circle. And the edge of the petal and the edge of the circle are rounded. So there are no hard edges. They're sculpted edges. And that's what constitutes a 3-dimensional folder. Now, you're going to have people saying all kinds of different opinions about that. This is just what I have been able to research and learn about the differences between the folders. But to each his own. I just find that the ones that have the stiff edges, the hard edges, are not 3-dimensional because they don't sculpt. Sculpting, to me, is the key for 3D. All right. Now, the other thing we have to talk about at this point is industry standards. So I'm going to tell you right off the bat, there is none. There are no industry standards in terms of 3D plates. The 2D plates can be thinner or thicker, but they all can go through your big shops and your cutting machines with the same sandwich. So they tend to use when I do it, I'll show you 2 plates and your base, and they're fine. So there's a flexible range of thicknesses for these, but they all go through fine. These two, you can see a difference between, this is considered the multi-level, and it's even thicker than the 3D. So I'll bring that up a little closer. Do you see how much thicker that multi-level one is than the 3D one? And so, there's no comparison there. And when you look at the 3D one compared to the the 2-dimensional one, you can see a huge difference. And I'm just going to pull out, this is a Spellbinders plate, but I also have a Sizzix plate. Both of these are 3D plates, but there is a huge difference in the thicknesses between these plates. So no industry standard at all. This is why figuring out the sandwich for your plate is super important, and recording it so you don't forget. So let's just go back a minute here. Just turning my notes, make sure I covered everything. So I'm going to actually do in-action stuff right now. We're going to talk a bit about positioning on the plate. We're going to talk about how to address the plate, what kind of sandwich to use. So if you have a pad of paper or something and you would like to take notes, feel free to do so. I have them written up, so if you have any questions, I can always refer to those. So your basic start to embossing is your base plate, and you can follow the instructions, but I know mine off by heart. I'm going to use, I'm doing a 2-dimensional plate. I don't need the thin cut die adapter, so that's going to go away for a moment. And I'm going to use my 2 base plates. Now, one quick tip about base plates. If you are wondering when you need to rotate your flip your base plates, it's when you can see some play in your plate. Can you see the bounciness of this plate? So whether you're cutting or using it for embossing, if you have play in your plate, that is the time to flip it over, because then there's no play, there's no movement. Well, there's a little bit of movement, but it's because it's malformed at the moment. And the best time to start that is when you first buy your plates. If you start it after they've already started to warp, you may get it back flat again by continually rotating when you have that play in it, or you may not. So it's best to start right when you get a fresh set of plates. All right, so I originally said that I was going to start with some copy paper. So here's some copy paper. Couple of tips. I don't put my paper right up to the inside of the folder because I don't want a line across my folder. I usually cut the piece the size I want it. So I make sure that I move it just down that little smidgy bit of an inch away from that edge so that I get a nice clean cut. And these are generally bigger than the A2 size, so you can afford to be a little bit generous on your spacing. So that's one thing I don't do. The other thing I don't do is put it right up to the front. I leave myself about 1.5 inches before the die cutting machine hits the plate. And in addition to that, if I have the space and my paper's not too difficult, I just tilt it slightly like you would do with a die. So now you're going to put your plate on, your top plate on, and you have some space. It's not going to hit, I call this the wall of doom, because sometimes when you hit that wall or that flat edge on a die or an embossing folder, you just won't get a good cut, or it'll shift things. So you want to try to avoid that. So another thing you want to watch for is when it's ready to go. Do you see how my handle here is moving? So I know I'm starting to go into the actual press plate when that handle moves. So once I've got it in that position, I just simply encourage it along and I run it through like this. You should only have to run a 2D folder through once if you have the right amount of sandwich. So here's our finished result. It's very nice and embossed. The problem is with the light paper, you will see that it has a little bit of cut, and that's those hard edges I was telling you about. You can see that it's broken up, or maybe you can't see. It's been broken up on the surface. That is putting it through on its own without any water. So what I have learned is that you can even put thin paper through as long as you water it so you don't get those cut marks. So let's try that again. Now this is thin paper that we're watering. And when you water thin paper, you're going to notice that it gets see-through almost, but that'll be fine because you're going to let any paper that you add water to, you'll need to make sure that you allow it to dry before you do anything. Otherwise, you could flatten out the emboss. All right. So again, leave myself some space. Make sure I'm still on the plate with the back of the folder. Kitty corner it, left, right, doesn't matter. Put this on top, the top plate. Push it in until I see my handle move, and then run it through. All right. Now, I've wet this, so it's very limp and wet, but now you can see that there are no cuts and bruises on it. So it does much better. My order summary on the back there. It does much better when you wet it, even though it's a 2D folder, if you're using thin papers. So keep that in mind. All folders, if it's thin papers, need to be wet to get a nice clean edge, especially if they're sharp, hard edged. All right, now I'm going to do this with cardstock. I'm using an 80-pound cardstock, which is what I usually use for my embossing. And it is, generally speaking, the size I want for my card. This is actually a 4x6. It's not quite what I would use, so it would end up being shorter in the folder, but because I was cutting from a 12x12, I just went ahead and made it 4x6. Putting it in the system again, a little bit on an angle, pushing it through until this begins to move. And sometimes you hear that little cracking like you do when you have a die. It's perfectly fine. It's just things shifting around inside the sandwich. And without using any water, it comes up and through perfectly on that 80-pound paper. So this, you can use any folder on light paper, but you just have to make sure that you're using some water to help it bend over those edges. Otherwise, it embosses beautifully. So that's a 2D folder. Now we're going to try the, so first of all, I want to make sure I covered everything. So you only need to run through once. That's the key there. You can do it wet and dry, but wet is better if you're doing light paper. You don't need to do, if you're doing cardstock, you don't need to put any water on it at all. All right, so now this is our multi-level. Remember, we have 3 levels in here, but again, it has those hard edges. So I'm not going to bother showing you that you need to put water on your paper to run it through the machine, because you already know that. I've already shown you that anything that's under 3D at least, or anything, any folder, you need to have some water for very thin paper. So what we're going to do is we're going to put through this in the same sandwich. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to show you something. I am getting a piece of my paper out, and it's again my 80-pound cardstock. I'm going to close up the folder. I'm going to put my cover on, and I'm just making it slightly angled. And now I'm going to push it through the machine. Oh my goodness. That I can feel is going to really put a lot of pressure on the pressure plate inside my machine. It does not want to go. It's really giving me a hard time. So that tells me that I need to now look at this in embossing as a 3D folder. So I do not need 2 plates for a 3D folder. I just need 1 top plate, and I'll use the one that's nice and clean so you can see through it, and a bottom plate. So this is normally how I would do a 3D folder. So I'm going to push that through, and it feels good. I feel good pressure, everything. It's happening wonderfully, having no problem getting it through. So my multi-level, because there were multiple levels, does need to have the pressure the same as a 3D folder, and it comes out beautifully. Now, I do notice that on some of the little pieces, there might be a little bit of drag, and that means like the stretching of the paper. So this could be a potential opportunity for you to put water on the front and back so that you are able to mold it over more closely. Okay, so a multi-level in this case behaves much like a three-dimensional one, but your results are levels and hard walls. Okay, so we'll put that there. And now I want to do the 3D piece. Now the 3D piece depends on what kind of folder you use. So we're going to do an experiment with this folder. This folder is much thinner than the gray folders that are quite thick. So I'm going to see if I can put it through and it behaves the same as putting it through as a 3D folder. The other thing I'm going to do, I know for a fact with any 3D folder, whether it's thick or thin, you do need to wet your paper. So I put a spray on the front and a spray on the back. I'm just doing that off camera right now. So it's ready to go. And if you think you've got too much water, don't worry about it because it will dry. You need to make sure you dry the embossing folder if you plan to do something that has ink, but if you're just doing regular paper, you don't have to worry about it. So I'm going to run this through. Now this is too big for me to sort of kitty corner it, so I'm going to make sure that my paper does not go past the end of my plate, and I'm going to give it lots of room for moving through the system. So I am not getting any push at all. So there's no push from this at all. So let me try putting that back on, which is what a 3D plate should do. But look, again, I can, oh, it just barely touches. So when you have a plate that is thin and doesn't have any pressure, like I feel no resistance whatsoever on this plate. There's a couple of things you can do. One of the things that you can do is to use the Thinlits plate. So let's try that. We're going to put the Thinlits plate. The Thinlit plate is a little bit thinner. This one is damaged on that side. So let me show you on this side. It's a little bit thinner than the clear plate. So rather than put two clear plates on, which I know won't work, I'm going to put the Thinlits plate on and a cover plate and see what happens. Oh, that's way too much pressure. I can feel it doesn't want to go in. My thing is popping up here. So that's too thick. So I cannot use my thin die adapter for that. So I have shims. So I'm going to try shims. Now I know that my shim has to be just a little less thick than two of these. So I'm going to keep the top plate and I'm going to put 3 shims in because that's all I have. So we're going to try it with 3 shims. And I think I'll put the shims underneath just because that helps them to stay in place. All right, give myself a little bit of space for rolling. And I'm going to put this on top. And there's no pressure. I feel no pressure at all. So 3 shims is not going to work. I'm going to keep the shims there because I think I'm going to use cardstock. And I have 3 pieces of cardstock here. I have the shims as well. These are the same size as what's inside my folder. So I am going to, first of all, make sure things don't fall down. Put it right over where the card is in my folder. Put my top plate on. Oop, ugly top plate. Nice top plate. And let's see what happens. Oh, now it's starting to move. And it comes up a little bit, but not too high. And it goes through. So the recipe for this particular folder, I have to record because it's not your standard recipe. I'll just put aside what I did and show you first the finished image. So this is a 3D folder, as I said, because everything is rounded and smooth. Like the edges of the petal are rounded. The circle in the center is a rounded, like a ring. And because of the fact that I put water on, because most 3D folders need water, it has done an awesome job of replicating that pattern. It's a beautiful pattern. So before I go on to other folders, I need to make sure that I put some kind of indicator as to what I just did with this folder so I don't have a problem next time. So I use a sticky note and a pen, of course, or a pencil. A pencil would work. And I am going to write down 3 shims and 3 80-pound cardstock. I put cardstock, card, same thing. All right, now I flipped my folder over so it goes on the back and stays out of my way. I'm just going to stick that on the corner with a couple of pieces of tape on there. And this is such thin stuff that it won't affect your emboss. And then when I put this back into the packaging that it came in, that's going to be on the back for the next time I open it up, and I'll know exactly what to do.
Kris?
Yeah.
Before you move on, and these have been some fantastic tips. Diane is asking, does the order of each type of sandwich matter? And earlier she was asking, does it matter whether the thin adapter plate or your shims go on top or below? So maybe you can talk about whether that sandwich has a specific
orientation
orientation, yeah, or what's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I have my own personal thoughts on that. I don't know what the big guys say because I haven't really looked into that specifically. I find as long as the most amount of things that are being added go on top, it goes through better. For instance, when I put this plate under the clear glass, I just put it under because I can't see so there's my die cutting or my embossing folder. There's my top plate. If I put this on top, I can't see what's going on. I like to make sure that things don't shift as I'm pushing them through. And I want to turn things on an angle. So for me, it's just a preference to have it on the bottom so that I can see clearly what's going on between my 2 plates. Okay, that's it. Now with the shims and everything, because these are so slippery, it's better for them to be on the bottom, and also because I can't see through them, that's the other reason. And then because I'm using cardstock that was the same size as my shape, and I wanted to make sure I covered my shape, I put the cardstock on top, right? I don't have to do that. I can put my cardstock. Let me just get a folder here. So I could put my cardstock on top of the plate of the embossing folder and this on top, as long as I can see that that cardstock is sitting on the folder. I could have done it this way. I probably wouldn't because I'd be afraid that it might get pushed off. I could put it on top of the actual top plate, but I would be afraid that that would catch in the machine. The other way I could do it is I could put it down first and then line up my card first, which seems to me to be backwards because it's about the card, not about the shims. And that could go on top. So that would still work, but to me that makes little sense, because if I've already got my things sprayed and in the folder and I'm working with my shims, I don't want to now take this out of the machine and move things around. I would rather just stick that right on top where it needs to go with the top plate to keep it from pushing the paper out of the way and putting it through. Does that help? It's preference for me. All right. Please let me know if I've answered or haven't answered the question, because I can give it another shot if you like. All right. So now I'm going to be working with these thick plates, and both of these are 3D, officially 3D plates. They're both the same company, so the profile on them is the same. The only difference is that this hasn't been used as much, so it's not as flat, but they are identical profiles. So you can do these again with light paper. I'm going to grab a piece of paper, but of course you have to spray it down so that you have some water on it. And 3Ds need a top cover. If you have the right sandwich, you will not have to run any of your embossing through more than once. It's when you have the wrong sandwich that you have to go back and forth and back and forth, and putting pressure down on the machine to try to make it and force it to go across your embossing folder is going to, what I call, depressurize your roller. So your roller is in there, but the more you force it to roll in a different way or roll through too thick a base, you're going to change the pressure that it has and wear it out much quicker. So again, I'm angling my piece. I'm leaving some space at the top. I'm pushing it through. Well, I can just push it through until I can see this wiggling, and then I just roll it through. Now with thin paper, it goes through really easy. With thicker paper, it's a little bit more difficult. That almost felt like I probably needed a shim, but when I pull it out, it's a little wet. It still looks great. And you can see all the little bits and pieces. All right. Now I'm going to do it with an 80-pound cardstock. Just a little bit of water. You can never really put too much water, as long as you're not shifting the paper inside the embossing folder. The water won't ruin it. You just have to make sure you dry it. So I'm pushing it in and running it through. I only go once. That's all you need to do. If you're pressing, like I said, or having to go more than once, you're running into trouble. So see how rounded and sculpted it is? That's the key to the 3D effect on these embossing folders. Now, I want to do a test, because I want to find out if rolling it back and forth 3 times is going to make a difference. So I want to prove to you it isn't, but I will do the test. So here is rolling it through once, and you can see all the lovely shaped sculptural aspect of it. I'm going to spray this again the same way I did before and put it in my embossing folder. Put the whole thing on an angle, put my top plate on, and now I'm going to run it through 3 times. So there's number 1. There, and I'm just holding this because it's wiggling everything. There's number 2. There's number 3. So I've gone 3 times with my embossing folder. Let's see if it makes a difference. Can you see a difference? Does it look any different to you? I don't see a difference. It looks exactly the same. Even the dots, the little tiny dots there, are the same. So running through once, twice, 3 times makes no difference to the finished product. They end up being exactly the same. So I proved my point only once. Now, if you have to go more times and push down on your machine, it means you need to do the shims or add some paper. It's just the varied sizes between the plates. You need to make sure you're accounting for that when you're doing your embossing. And this is a beautiful plate here. I just want to show you the amount of detail you can get. All right. Again, plate here. Running it through. Oops, I didn't watch what I was doing there. Hopefully it worked out okay. Now again, this is wet, but look at the intensity of the leaves. Oh, I can't really, oh, I know what I can do. I can turn out a light. There we go. Can you see it? Maybe this way. Each one of these little leaves has stripes in it. I can't really get it to show for you, but the detail is so intense on this one, and it looks like a pillow. I can't believe how much it looks like a pillow. So backwards and forwards, the little lines, the details in the little lines. I'm sorry, I can't get that to show. But it is beautiful. And it's something you can't get with a hard edge 2D or more multi-layer embossing folder. Oh, and I should mention the back sides are as nice as the front sides. So this is concaved, and these little guys are convex. These now are convex, and those are concave, and they're beautiful in both directions. And there's all kinds of different techniques you can use to augment these when you're using white paper or even colored paper. And I think that's it for demo. I just want to make sure I have gone over everything. So sandwich is key. Shimming is important if you find that you're having to go through more than once, or if you feel no pressure as it's going through. And you want to try all the stuff you have first. You want to try that thin die plate. You want to try 2 of the big plates. If none of that happens, get some shims or use multiple layers of paper and play around until you find the right combination and record it. Keep it recorded. Again, any of these that you've put water on, you want to make sure that you are letting them all dry out before you mess with them, even the copy paper ones, because as soon as if it's wet and you put pressure on it in any way, even if you're just putting some ink on it, you're going to end up flattening that sculptural paper stretching. All right, and I think I've given you pressure solutions, and we checked that going through multiple times does not make a difference unless you have the wrong sandwich. And you can use both sides of the paper because they're both equally beautiful. Well, not that one, that's my order. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Kris. This was a packed episode with lots of great tips and tricks. As we were watching all of this, several people chimed in that they have embossing folders, but maybe haven't used them in a while. So that, I think, is our homework challenge for everyone.
Yeah.
Go through your embossing folder stash, pick out one and use it on your next project. Or, Diane was saying that she sometimes struggled to figure out the shims.
Yep.
Well, maybe you just, you put on a good movie, you get out some paper and you play with your shims, you play with your embossing folders and figure that out so that when you are ready to create, you've got it all figured out already and you can just have fun with them versus struggling with them.
Yes. And I think that if everybody understands that the shim is the key, they will have a much more enjoyable time using them rather than a frustrating time using them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Kris, for a fantastic session. And everyone, we challenge you to get your folders out and play with them. Have a good night, everyone.
Whoop, sorry.
We're ending with a bang.
Bye.
Good night.